Good afternoon, everybody online as well. My name is Vili Lehdonvirta. I'm professor of economic sociology and digital social research here at the Oxford Internet Institute. And it is my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Liz Altman to give us an overview of her new book, Workforce Ecosystems, Reaching Strategic Goals with People, Partners, and Technologies. Now, Liz is an old friend by now. Liz has been a sort of key member of our platform economy seminar, remote seminar interest group for years now. And we've gotten to know her and her research very well. And it's really cool that now, for the first time, we have the opportunity to, in collaboration with Said Business School and Professor Pinar Osken and others, to welcome Liz in flesh to Oxford to present her work. And she will be giving further talks also at the Said Business School tomorrow.
Yes, tomorrow at 10:30 in the boardroom for those who are interested.
Tomorrow at 10:30 in the boardroom. But today, and today only, she will be presenting to us her new book, which is based on a multi-year research project into basically the future of the workforce. And I think I will let her tell us more about it. So once again, it's a great pleasure to have you here, Liz. And please, can we welcome Liz with a warm, oh, sorry, actually, before we do that, I should just tell you a little bit about her background probably. So she is an associate professor of management at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, also a research affiliate at MIT's initiative on the digital economy, a guest editor for the future of the workforce at MIT Sloan Management Review, and she's been a visiting professor at the US Military Academy, West Point, visiting scholar at Harvard Business School, and had many other achievements and accolades to her name. So with that, Professor Altman, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, really. It is truly a pleasure to be here. I think it was probably sometime in early 2020 when I started joining you all on Zoom, and I thought one day maybe I'll get to go to Oxford. So it's great to be here. So I am thrilled to be here to welcome you in person and those who are online to talk about some research I've been doing for the past few years with MIT Sloan Management Review and Deloitte. And it's not a pure bait and switch, but it's a slight bait and switch in that I'm going to talk to you a little about the research leading up to the book, because the book is really a compilation of a few years worth of research. So I think it makes most sense first to tell you what I mean and what we mean when we say workforce ecosystems, then to go through the two research reports that we did that again fed into the book. Then recently we published an infographic, and it's a kind of fun way to show the results of some of our work. So I thought I would show you that. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the book. It is coming out April 11th. So we're down to a few weeks, following in Billy's footsteps with MIT Press, and very excited about that. And I should actually just say, let me go back for one moment. So my co-authors I list here: David Kieran is at MIT Sloan Management Review, Jeff Schwartz and Robin Jones. Jeff is retired from Deloitte, now at Gloat. Robin is at Deloitte. They're my co-authors on the book. And we've also had many other collaborators from Deloitte and Sloan Management Review on this research. And if you look at each piece, you'll see various co-authors, and you should take a look at that. So without further ado, so this is our landing page at Sloan Management Review. So if you get bored or you need to leave or you take a nap, then you can go to this website and this will allow you to see, and you can just search for Future of the Workforce Sloan Management Review, and all of our reports and infographics and short articles, everything other than the book, we post here. And there's a video of a presentation that I did. So that's kind of our main page. So let me take a step back. It was early 2020. I received an email from David Kieran, and he said at SMR, and some of you may have received emails from him because emails tend to come from his name when he has a survey that he wants people to, and we did one of these surveys. So his email said, this is not a survey. This is not spam. I know who you are. I know Mike Tushman, who is my advisor, which I think was his key that this is really not a robot, sending an email. Can we talk about the future of the workforce? So I said, sure. So we had this conversation about whether I was going to be interested in working with him on future of the workforce. And I said to him at the time, I've looked at your work and it looks like mostly what you're concentrating on is within the organization. It's kind of HR centric, and I'm not really that interested in doing research on within an organization. I study platforms and ecosystems. And he said, no, we know exactly what you study, which is why we're interested. And we think the future of work involves more outward looking, spanning organizational boundaries type of work. So please, let's try this. And I said, well, if we can do it as an experiment, let's do it. So we did. And so in the beginning, we started interviewing people. And because we had Deloitte and because we have MIT, we had incredible access. So we were interviewing people like the head of HR at Walmart, someone at NASA, someone at Amazon, a bunch of people, and some entrepreneurs and military and university. I'll talk a little bit more about it. And I realized as I started conducting the interviews that I had to kind of do some level setting. So I would say, before we get too far, when I say workforce, what do you think of? What do you think I mean? And almost to a person, and you'll hear this, you'll see it in our work, they would say, oh, that is a very good question. It's changing, or we had a meeting about that this morning, or, I'm not sure. And I thought, this shouldn't be that complicated a question, right? I mean, at first I thought, I wouldn't have thought this was that complicated. Turns out it's very complicated and interesting and changing. And we were able to launch a whole series of research around that question. So let me just take you through. So employees, right? So that's the base, right? When we say workforce, often people mean employees. And as a matter of fact, when you talk to many executives and you say, you're talking about the company, they'll say we have X number of people, right? But for example, Novartis has, I think, 100,000 employees and 50,000 contractors. Cisco has something like around 83,000 employees and about 50,000 what they call contingent workers. And the numbers go on, right? And so employees are, in the US, we would call them W-2 because that's a tax form that they get, right? They are hired. They often have benefits, medical benefits, retirement benefits. They can be full or part-time, but they work for the company. And that's as opposed to contractors, freelancers, gig workers, right? Who are on contract of some sort. And generally speaking, they can be short or long-term. And the other thing that I've more recently been paying attention to is they can be employees of someone else, right? So they could work for a temp agency or some other organization, and then they could be a contractor. So there are kind of levels of employee and contractor, but for the sake of this discussion, kind of for the focal firm, the company we're talking about, they're contractors. Often, there are times when they've been there for 15 years, right? And there are other times they've been there 6 weeks, right? They all fall into this bucket of what some people would call contingent labor. One other point about them is, and I'm not sure the extent which you can see, but they can be very highly skilled. So this one says M&A expert, this says product designer, this is UX UI designer, right? They can be tech, they can be non-tech, right? CFOs often work for 2 or 3 different startups, right? So they can be financial, they can also be lower skilled, workers that you'd find on a platform. Subcontractors. So this is Amazon Prime in the US. When Amazon decided that they were going to really launch a delivery service as part of their service, they didn't just hire all those people. They introduced a program that allowed entrepreneurs to become subcontractors to them. So Amazon has this truly enormous and global, because I think you guys can get Amazon Prime delivered here, right? Right. So at least in the US, often someone will show up at your house in an Amazon uniform, in an Amazon van that is not owned by Amazon, and they are not Amazon employees, right? So then the question becomes, are they part of the workforce? And I would say, well, they are certainly doing work for the organization, and the organization couldn't do their work without them. So therefore, I would say, yes, they're part of the workforce, right? And same thing with those contractors, right? If the company can't do the work without them, and they're contributing work, then does that make them part of the workforce? And in our kind of newer, more holistic, more integrated way of thinking about workforces, we would say yes, right? So complementary businesses, if any of you study platforms, which I think some of you do, or strategists, we talk about complementers a lot. And again, they're not traditionally considered part of the workforce. Often there's not even a contract between a complementary company and the primary company, right? So if you have a phone and you have an app on it, often those apps are made by an app developer who is not either the company that made the phone, the Samsung or the Apple, or even Android or whoever made the OS. It's a third party who makes the app. And yet, if you said, well, are they contributing value to the product? Would the product be the same without them? You would say no. Product wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't even work. I mean, often I'll ask a big room of people, how many of you have a phone and the only software on it is made by Android or Apple, right? And it's nobody, right? Everybody has some other type of app, right? So then you say, okay, those people who work for some other company, right? They work for Nintendo, they work for Spotify, they work for a bank, they work for whomever who's making the app. Are they part of Android's or Samsung's or Apple's workforce? And at first you would say, well, no, they're not an employee, they're not a contractor. Say, well, but they can't really supply their product and service without those people. So are they part of the workforce or not? And we would say they're part of the workforce ecosystem. And that's how we're defining it. Right. Similarly, you can think about auction websites, eBay or Amazon. Often you'll buy something on Amazon. You're not really buying it from Amazon, right? They're playing the standard marketplace. They're playing broker, right? So again, you would say somebody sitting out in the countryside somewhere selling books, they don't work for Amazon, right? So in traditional formulation, they're not part of the workforce. But again, Amazon can't offer, they can't meet their strategic goals, strategic objectives. They can't actually accomplish what they're trying to accomplish without those people and organizations. They're not partners, they don't have joint ventures with them, they're on a platform, but we would say they're part of the workforce. And finally, chatbots, robots, other technologies. So you go to how many people have tried to interact with the bank recently, online, or any other organization, right? Anybody?
All the time.
Anybody fought with a virtual assistant recently? Right?
Yes.
Please give me a human.
Yeah.
I want to speak with a human. You are not a human. Give me a human, right? Okay, so they're operating though as part of the workforce, right? So one of my favorite stories is I was talking to a gentleman at NASA. He's quite senior at NASA. And he said, we started to give our software bots employee ID numbers. Wow. I was like, wait, what? And he said, well, they need access to data. And the only way you can get access to data on our systems is if you can log in with an employee ID. So we don't give them badges, but they do have employee ID numbers. They don't have email addresses, but they might, because there needs to be a way to address them. And then you think about it and you say, okay, well, you don't do performance management with them. Well, you kind of do, right? Because you check the metrics on how efficient they are and how effective they are. Say, well, you don't pay them, they don't have a salary. Well, you kind of do, because you have to decide to what extent you're going to invest in them and improving them. So if they're part of the resource allocation process where you're deciding whether you're going to pay for them or not. So they become part of this as well. Right? So in total, we start to think about, and we said, okay, if you think about the future of work and you think about future workforces, this concept of a workforce ecosystem actually becomes quite useful and an interesting way to think about what it takes to accomplish work. So this was the first article we published. This was January 2021. It's a very short 4-page article called "The Future of Work is Through Workforce Ecosystems." Again, kind of putting forth this notion that we think you need to think about workforce ecosystems towards the future of work. This is essentially the page you get to, the other page that I showed you. And so in January, we came out with that article. And then in April, we came out with our first report. I'm going to spend a few minutes now telling you about that 2021 report. And then if you want to have a little bit of fun with our data, we created an interactive from our survey data, and you can mess around with it and filter it in different ways and look at it. And it's pretty cool. So that's that, right? So what do we do? In the beginning, we defined a workforce ecosystem. And I've given you kind of the long version, but let me give you so we did a slightly simplified version, but I snuck in some academic terms, and then we put them as a little asterisk. So we said it's a structure. So we think of it as a governance structure focused on value creation for an organization that consists of complementarities and interdependencies. So if you look at like Rahul Kapoor's work on ecosystems, if you happen to be a platform and ecosystem scholar, or any of the traditional ways that academics look at ecosystems, you see that interdependencies and complementarities are part of the nature of an ecosystem, right? And so that's what makes this different also than like a group of strategic alliances, for example, although we could have that conversation. But this interdependencies and complementarities notion, and that they interact with each other in this way, not only with the focal firm, but with each other. And it encompasses actors from within the organization and beyond, working to pursue both individual and collective goals. And that is also essential, right? Because if you're only worried about the collective goals, and if you don't worry about the goals of the individuals or the smaller organizations participating, then you probably don't hit the objectives, right? And then down here, we say by complementarities, we mean some members of the system work independently, yet together they offer value, and they essentially succeed or fail together, right? Well, and then by interdependencies, we say some members rely upon one another for their shared success or failure, they win or lose together, right? So sorry, complementarities is they offer value together for mutual customers. Interdependencies, they succeed or fail together, right? And so I'll share just a few quotes. There's more in both of the reports. Actually, I brought for you, this is the 2022 report. We printed a rare few actual hard copies. So if you want to take a look at it and see, and in the back is all of the survey data. That's the 2022 one that I'll talk about. And the PDFs are online. So Michael Smith is the CEO of Randstad SourceRight, which is a large labor platform. And he says, our customers don't perceive the contingent workforce to be hired help. They perceive them to be a reflection of our brand. Meaning, again, if you're on the outside and you end up interacting with a company and you end up talking with a contractor, you don't really care whether it's a contractor or an employee. You think you're interacting with the company. And thus, it's important that that contingent worker, contractor, whoever it is, reflects the brand, right? And that's an important point here. So here's our data from the first year, right? This is part of the data. This is this is survey research, and we did 27 executive interviews also. So we had 5,000 survey respondents, business executives, managers, analysts, global organizations representing 138 countries, 28% from the US, more than 2/3 outside the US, which I think is great, right? Because it's not just a US phenomenon at all. 29 industries. People say, oh, this is just tech. I can tell you for a fact that it's not just tech. 26% of revenue over $1 billion. So that's interesting. This isn't just small companies, right? But what's even more interesting is about 3/4 are smaller companies, right? And there's very different reasons why, on one hand, a Novartis or Unilever, Walmart, someone like that cares about this, right? They're trying to fill in skills gaps, or they're trying to move in a new direction, or they have to hire temporary help when people leave for various reasons. That's different than an entrepreneur who's trying to grow and can't afford the types of people maybe they want, or want some flexibility. So often the drivers are a little bit different, but you end up with the same idea of this interconnected, networked, more complex workforce. Okay. And we did 27 executive interviews. As I said, C-suite, other executives, academics, leaders, other subject matter experts. Phenomenal, amazing talking to these people. Yes.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Did you see any country differences in terms of developing different geographic regions?
Right. So we have all that data, the demographic data. We have not done all the cuts on it yet, but I'd like to. I don't think we're going to, I mean, from the bits and pieces, actually, we can look at the interactive for the 2021 data and we can just look at it online because it's loaded in. I don't think we're going to see dramatic differences, right? I think that it's pretty much across the board, but it would be interesting to see. It's a really good question. Yes, and if others, I know we're not monitoring Zoom. I should just say this, we're not monitoring the Zoom for the questions right now, but we will, when I'm done speaking, we will look at the Q&A there. So if any questions, please put them in the Q&A on Zoom for those of you who are online, and for anyone in the room, take questions then. But if you have any quick questions like this, please feel free to interrupt. Okay, so here are some drivers of workforce change that we can just talk about. That these are, themes that started to come out in the first year of the research. So, and we've heard echoed as we go through this. So the nature of work is changing, right? It's becoming more project-based, it's becoming more skills-based, becoming more time-bound, becoming often more complex and cross-organizational. Right? Workers' preferences are shifting. Right? We saw this starting to happen before COVID and the pandemic. It was accelerated by the pandemic. So I'll also say that. Some people say, was this a pandemic phenomenon? I will say no. Most of these trends were in play before the pandemic. There is no doubt that workforces and work has changed through the pandemic, and I think mostly accelerating what we've seen, right? And I think these trends will continue long into the future for some of these reasons. So technology is transforming how we engage and manage the workforce. In the book, we break up technologies into different types of technologies. I can talk a little bit about that, but workforce technologies, work technologies, HR technologies, technologies as a participant in the workforce, as I said. And then there's a whole discussion about credentialization and verification and blockchain and how that then plays into mobility of workers. And we find that many workers consider themselves free agents versus loyal employees. This has been a pretty interesting finding that we've looked at in a few different ways, where even employees, if you ask them, well, do you consider yourself a free agent or a loyal employee? They will say free agent, right? So people are looking in terms of where's my next move? What can I do? What are my opportunities? Even when they are full-time employees. So that means your full-time employees are often thinking of themselves more in some ways as the contractors, right? So we have to think about what that means. So more than 8 out of 10 respondents consider external contributors to be part of their workforce. So one of the places we're going to get to with this is, what does this mean for management? What does it mean for leaders, right? As this world is changing more into this way, right? So first of all, 87% consider their workforce to encompass more than their employees. And this was in 2021. I think the number is 93% in 22. I would say it just continues to grow. Right? We're getting to a point where it doesn't even make sense to ask the question anymore. It's kind of taken for granted. Yes, right. This is the way workforces are. I will tell you the number that we're hearing, and we kind of continue to hear, is that 30 to 50% of large organizations are contingent. So some people say, look, contractors have been around for a long time, right? You can go back to the 80s, 90s, and before, there were always, contractors. But they used to be like 5% of the workforce, right? They used to be really on the fringes. Organizations weren't using them in the way they're using them now. So that's another question when people say, well, why is this such a big deal now? Say, well, when you have 30% of an organization, 50% of an organization, that's contingent of some sort or extended in some way, then it changes the game. So 13% consider their workforce to encompass only full-time and part-time employees when this was done. So Marcus Graff is a very forward-thinking manager, head of talent for Novartis, and he said, will manage the external workforce even more actively. So he's very aware of this notion of having to manage the external workforce, not only to attract labor, but also for access to skills we may not have enough of internally, right? It's becoming even more important in tech-related work where skilled talent is less inclined to join a traditional workforce. So the other night I was at an event in Cambridge, Mass, not Cambridge, UK, and at dinner, and there was a woman speaking who was on a number of very large international, multinational company boards. And I asked her the question, kind of tried to succinctly say, this is what I study, and is this something that you think about in boardrooms, right? And she said, absolutely. And I said, why do you think this is happening? And she said, particularly when companies are shifting or undergoing a business move or a strategic move, they use even more flexible labor choices to kind of try out new things, to figure out how to get there quickly. And so as innovation accelerates, as companies are moving strategies even more quickly, I would expect this trend to also continue to accelerate. So in 2021, we saw every category was expected to grow over 18 to 24 months, which isn't surprising. Which was surprising a little bit to me was that people said, when we asked, which do you expect to grow the most, or how much do you expect them to grow over the next, do you expect them to grow over the next 18, 20, 24 months? Technology for workforce automation, so AI, chatbots, et cetera, was the highest. Second highest was developers and or accessory providers. So, and again, this is across industries, right? Saying that we expect that we'll have more complementers, basically. So one way to think about this is that you have the traditional employee life cycle from an HR standpoint, but I think a broader look is the traditional employee life cycle moving to a workforce ecosystem approach. And I don't have the time to go through all of these in a lot of detail, but I'm happy to kind of come back to them. But these are areas that traditionally have been the realm of HR, right? And things that you would worry about for employees, but often, mostly, the flexible parts of your workforce are not included in HR. So that's also amazing to me, right? We have a subtitle somewhere that says human resources doesn't include all the humans, right? Because if you have 100,000 people who are employees and HR is responsible for them, but you have 50,000 contractors and procurement is essentially responsible for them, then, for example, when you do an employee engagement survey, it goes to the 100,000, but it doesn't go to the 50,000. Right? When you start to look at engagement, when you start to think about learning and development, right? Any of these topics, right, basically have to be different for anyone who is not an employee. And by the way, I haven't mentioned it yet, but I should. Labor laws play a huge role in this whole discussion, and they vary by geography dramatically. Right? So in some places, you're not allowed to offer training to contractors, right? And you're not allowed to do performance management in a traditional way. So you can have certain metrics on what is accomplished, right? You can have it be very transaction-based, but you can't do a proper performance management. And if you do, you run the risk of them being considered employees. I would imagine many people have heard of some of the trouble Uber has had with, in some countries, in some states, right? Should the drivers be considered contractors or should they be considered employees? And different people have different views on this, including different Uber drivers, whether they, and rideshare in other countries as well, right? So it's all wrapped up in this discussion. Okay, so this is a quote from Major General Clark, excuse me, from the Army. He says, you have to think about holistically, you have to really harness the power that is your entire workforce to be successful. I've got to make sure we're building an entire team that's inclusive. There's a whole diversity, equity, inclusion discussion that goes along with this. It's about pulling everybody in. We can't have people who are not inside the family being treated differently. They're here. Somebody brought them to the family reunion, right? And I've learned a lot from working with the military and talking with some of our military, US military leaders about this notion of ecosystem leadership and leading in an ecosystem environment, right? Often in their most complex situations, they have multiple branches of the armed forces, so they could have Navy, Army, Air Force together, but they also can have multiple countries, and they can have police forces and government forces from countries where they're working, and those people don't work for them, right? But they work for them kind of temporarily in this kind of networked way. It's very similar to what we're seeing here. So we think that there's a lot we can learn from some of these organizations who have been coping with this for a long time. So that's been fun also, again, to realize it's not only tech, and it's not only big companies, it's also across organizational types, right? Kathy Benko is a board member at Nike, brought up this issue of who owns it, right? A business unit leader's job is to get the work done. It's not their job to figure out how they develop all the skills needed. The project guy doesn't own it. HR doesn't own it. Accounts payable doesn't own it. Who owns it, right? And the reality is most of these companies aren't quite sure yet, right? They're thinking about it. And one of my favorite Nike stories was the week the pandemic started. Nike managers got in the room and they said, how many people are working for Nike and where are they? Because we need to know, we want to do the right thing. We want to make sure there's payroll continuity. We want to make sure there's safety. We want to make sure we're getting information to everybody. Where is everybody? And they said, we have no idea. They looked at HR and HR said, I can tell you exactly the number of employees. I can tell you their email, anyone who has an email address, I can give you their name and all. But if they went and hired 5,000 software developers in the IT department, or 1,000 people in the marketing department, or the engineering department hired another 3,000 over there, there was no aggregate way across businesses across the world to figure out who at any given time was actually working for Nike, right? And so they've since fixed that, right? But it took, you can just imagine, just think about the scale and the cross-functional nature of this discussion and the cross-functional nature of the problem, right? It's not an obvious problem, and it's not ridiculous. Like, of course, right? Some business unit manager needed 1,000 people, 5,000, 10,000 people. They had the budget. They went and hired them, right? Or engaged them. They didn't hire them as employees. And there was just no central tracking. The question.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating, and there's potentially a tension. I wonder whether you've also seen this. So that in your survey, it seems like most of those, say, contractors see themselves as free agents rather than part of the labor force for an organization. Yet a lot of your quotes are about being inclusive.
Yeah.
So do these people want to be included? What is their perspective?
Yes. So this is a couple of things on this. It's a great question. So first of all, I would say we have not yet done enough on the worker perspective. And I think that is definitely an area that we will move more into as we take this forward. So we've done some, not all. Second, I think there's an underlying assumption that contractors want to be included, right? And so there's this underlying assumption that we talk about culture, and there's a whole question around how do you build a culture and shared values and shared understanding when part of the organization is more flexible and contingent. And it's in one of the reports, I don't remember which year, and it's definitely in the book. There's a small company called Planomatic who had many hundreds of contractors. And the CEO very much tried to bring the contractors on board, right? And, they have parties, they would send them t-shirts, they would, do all the things that you think about of like building culture. And at one point, some of the contractors said to him, honestly, I don't want your t-shirts. I don't want your hats. And I definitely don't want to come to your parties. I want you to send me tasks. I will complete the tasks and I will send you outcomes or results. Mm-hmm. If I wanted to work for a company and be at parties and be all excited, I would go get a job like that. And so he realized that there are some percentage that want to be part of things and some percentage are very happy to be transactional. And so this question of building so I've started to think about, what does it mean to build a relationship with an employee and to get an employee or a worker and get a worker engaged. And I think that relationship in some cases can be transactional, and some cases will be more, what we consider more of a community type of a relationship, right? And then there becomes a question of values, right? So do you have, and we talk about, I'll get to it in a few minutes, ethics, social responsibility, things like that. So do you say, okay, fine, they don't have to be really part of the culture, but there's some underlying values that if they don't buy into, this is going to be problematic, right? So, we talk about minimum viable product when we do product design, things like that. So is there some minimum amount of values or minimal culture that you say, unless you kind of agree to this general mission, culture, values, etc., probably isn't a match.
Isn't there also a sort of more critical way of reading that example, which is that the contractor is saying, I don't want your t-shirts, I don't want your fake community. If you're not going to give me a pension and job security, then
Yes.
you can keep your t-shirts. See what I mean? Because companies like to do this thing where they say
Right.
you're part of family, but
you can't have medical benefits.
yeah, until the point you fall ill, then you're not family anymore. See what I mean?
That's true, but I think we're also seeing, like at least in the US, often if there are two adults, for example, who both have jobs and one has benefits, then the other one may not want benefits, right? I'd rather get paid more, right? Because essentially if you have two adults and both are in jobs and they're both getting full benefits, you're not going to be using it. So you're essentially leaving money on the table, right? So I think that can happen, definitely. I don't want your fakeness, but I also think there's some who say, I don't want your benefits either. I want you to just pay me more. Right. And I don't need your social safety net. I'm getting social safety net elsewhere. Right. But it's a very complicated problem. Okay, so 2021, we said, this is a really interesting problem. These people really care about it. And we have all this data. 2022, we said, okay, now we have to start figuring out what do we do about it and how should organizations start to think about this? And so we chose the word orchestrating. We can argue whether it's good or bad. I have mixed feelings about it. I think it's the best we have at the moment. One thing we talk about, I think in the report that I'm passing around, is the difference between orchestrating an orchestra, where the musicians, and this is in Reed Hastings' book also, right? Where an orchestra has very prescribed, the musicians have to follow the music very, very specifically. But for example, if you're conducting a jazz band, and there's much more improvisation and there's much more independence amongst the musicians, that's probably a better analogy, right? So when we talk about orchestration, we're not thinking about orchestras per se, but we're thinking about this notion of not being totally prescriptive and command and control and traditional hierarchical in how you manage the organization. Okay, so again, we do another set of surveys. This is just a summary, 29 industries, 4,000 managers, again, 129 countries, 19 thought leaders. And again, we kind of go through all the data and I'll share a little bit with you. So 93% use some external workers. So it was 87 before, it's 93% now. You're going to start to see these numbers that I'm going to share with you go down. I think that's the key point here. So 93% use some as part of their organization workforce. 74% agree effective management is critical to the organization's success. But interestingly, 26% don't think it's critical. Like, how do you really square that with 93% say, yes, they're part of the organization, but only 74% say, yes, it's important to know how to manage them. That's a little scary. And then 58% agree that organizations take an integrated approach to managing both employees and external contributors. That, of course, means 42% don't, which is also interesting. And then you get down to 30% agree their organization is sufficiently preparing to manage a workforce, right? That it will rely more on external contributors. So you've got 93% say, yeah, external workers are part of the organization. So you get the idea, right? And you get all the way down to 30% who says, yeah, it's important, but no, we really don't know what to do about it, right? So as a researcher, if you're interested in doing research in this area, I would say there's plenty of opportunity for just this reason, right? All right, so this is another data point just to give you some examples of what we learned. we built an index, which was a maturity index of how mature companies are on the scale. And we came up with these labels of, one is intentional orchestrators, and I'm talking about that. We said, okay, what's the difference between an intentional orchestrator, which is a company that intentionally is trying to orchestrate a workforce ecosystem, versus non-orchestrators who have no interest in doing this, right? Because we would argue that most companies today have a workforce ecosystem, whether they accept or agree or say that they do or not. Very few organizations are operating entirely with employees, with no partners, with no contractors, with no professional services firms. Most are not doing it, right? But there is a difference between those who kind of get that they are and are intentionally addressing that and those who aren't. So 49% of those who are intentional orchestrators agree leadership in their organization understands which type of work is suitable for internal or external. So there's a big question to figure out what should go where, right? And only 10% of the non-orchestrators say that their organization knows how to do it. So that's a perfect example of how we see these different groups of companies, right? So essentially, intentional orchestrators are roughly 5 times as likely as non-orchestrators to report their leaders understand how to distribute work, right, among the two. So I'll come back to the index in a bit. So our research shows companies that are most intentionally orchestrating have 5 common characteristics. And I'll quickly go through these, and then we're going to dive a little more into them in the infographic. So 1, they closely coordinate cross-functional management of internal and external. And again,
I'm sorry, I need to pick up my son from school.
no problem. Tell your son I said.
Thank you so much.
See you later. Okay, so cross-functional management, like again, this HR, procurement, finance, right? So intentional orchestrators have figured out they need to cross-functionally manage. They hire and engage internal and external talent that they need, both. They support managers who seek to hire external workers. There's a difference between organizations that kind of have the systems and have the processes to do this, and those that, like, some managers are doing it in spite of the internal processes. They have leadership that understands how to allocate work, again, for internal and external, and align their workforce approach with their business strategy. Okay, so again, we go into more detail in the reports. This is a framework that is in that report and is in the book, and we really kind of blow it out in the book more. And basically, this is an orchestration framework. And what we say is these 4 hexagons, management practices, technology enablers, integration architectures, and leadership approaches, are 4 themes. And if you're a qualitative researcher, they're themes that have emerged in our research of topics that are important to managers and important to organizations to understand as we think about workforce ecosystems, right? And so those are the 4 hexagons. And then around the outside, we have essentially 3 axes. So senior leaders and business unit leaders through the middle have to manage all this. Across the top, HR and procurement, often the 2 organizations who are actually engaging people, accessing talent, getting talent, working with professional service firms, et cetera. And then IT and finance legal also supporting this effort. And it depends what type of workers and which members of the workforce ecosystem you're talking about, who is spending the most time on it. Right? So I'll again come back to this when I talk a little more of the book. This framework is something that we are now going to spend much more time trying to understand better. We developed it. We're still pushing it. We like some parts of it better than others, right? But we think it really captures the main topics around workforce ecosystem orchestration. Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap up in about 5. We have an hour total, right? Okay, and that, yeah. So I'm going to spend about another 5 minutes and then leave 10 minutes for Q&A. Okay. So this is an infographic that just came out February 7th, so about a month ago. If you go to the website, it's the first time I was involved with creating an infographic. You scroll down and see it. We had professional designers working with us. It was extremely cool to, if you ever get to play with an infographic, to get to take your research and have it, really try to figure out how to have it visually displayed nicely. So it's here, and what I've done is I've pulled some of the panels, and I'll just show you a little bit about it. And so we did, so this year, so the first 2 years we did big research reports. This year we're doing 2 infographics and 2 shorter articles. March 15th, there's a new I'm getting to next steps early. March 15th, there's a new article coming out, which is essentially a case example of one company. I'll let you see what it is March 15th. And this is the first infographic. The next infographic that we're going to do is going to be a blowout of the hexagon and the different layers of the hexagon. We are working on that right now. So this is a blowout of the index and about intentional orchestrators. So this is another way to say what is a workforce ecosystem. We've already covered it, but I just wanted to show you that we show it in different ways. These definitions, I already talked about workforce ecosystem. We also talk about extended workforce and external contributors. Again, especially if you're a scholar or a writer and you deal with this, you're always dealing with terminology and definitions and trying to figure this out, right? So we kind of put a stake in the ground of how we refer to these. This is our index. We analyzed, again, more than 3,000 responses to the 22 survey, and we divide the respondents into these 3 maturity categories, as I said. So of the intentional orchestrators who I mentioned, that 12% are in that category. 74% are in the partial, which is what you would expect, and 14% are non, right? And we think we can learn the most really from the 12% because we think they're at the cutting edge of understanding this. But it's also important for us to know what's happening with the non-orchestrators, because why aren't they doing this and what would it take to get them to do it, et cetera. Yes.
Did you ever see a shift post the pandemic from non-intentional to intentional?
In my perfect world, I would have started this in 2019, but I didn't. So I don't, and I don't know yet. So I'm hoping, though, so we can't look at pre-pandemic to pandemic, but we can start to look at pandemic and thereafter, right? And so I don't see anything specific yet, but stay tuned. We've thought about how we can look at that over time. We debate also a little bit every year, you know, should we do another survey? I mean, it's a big deal to do these big surveys, right? So does it make sense? How much will we learn? Is that what we want to be doing versus more interviews versus this versus that? I think we'll do another big survey. I'm not sure. So intentional orchestrators excel at managing workforce ecosystems. And this is a little bit more about the index. So these are the 8 ways that they outperform non-orchestrators. And I'll go just through a few of them. I don't have time to go through all of them, right? But if you look at the infographic, you can see. So for example, number 2 is allocating work. And we say 89% of intentional orchestrators feel their organizations take the right approach to distributing work throughout their ecosystems. So we see 89% feel that way, 15% don't. And it is fun when we get these back and we can kind of split it and say, oh, wow, there really is a big difference between these two. Accessing workers, which is finding talent. We say 80% of intentional orchestrators are able to hire the employees that they need, and 91% will engage external contributors they need over the next 18 to 24 months to accomplish their organization's strategic objectives. We think those are very high numbers, right? And it's clear that intentional orchestrators are pushing that. Disregard the graphics that are funky, because this is what happens when you try to take an infographic and put it into PowerPoint. Intentional orchestrators are more than 6 times more likely than non-orchestrators to integrate external contributors into their culture. So this is starting to understand this question about culture. And I think probably the more transactional version is more in the minority. And by and large, they are really trying to get contingent workers more integrated, for better or worse. I'm not convinced yet. Cross-functional areas, 89% involve multiple functions in managing their workforce. Again, this is the kind of finance, HR, IT idea, 89 versus 29. And enhancing technology. So data and technology systems are really big questions. Do you have the right data and right technology systems for this? So 81% for intentional, 6% for non-orchestrators. So again, you see a huge difference in how they're looking at technologies. And we added this last panel in the infographic. It's also a big part of the book about labor laws and ethics and social responsibilities, right? It's become very clear. So David, my co-author, is an expert on ethics and philosophy. And it's become clear also as we talk to managers, other scholars, but C-suite executives, that this question of the social responsibility, the ethical implications of these various ways to engage with workers and what does it mean to be in a workforce ecosystem is an important topic area. And again, I think we're starting to scratch the surface. In the book, we start to ask some questions about it, but we're nowhere near there yet. So that's that. Okay, so the book, there is the book. I've not seen the book yet. It was supposed to arrive at my house, possibly before I arrived here. It didn't. It's probably sitting in a box at home right now. It is really just being printed, but it should look something like that.
Cool cover.
Thank you. We spent a lot of time on that cover, so thank you. I thought I'd just kind of run through the table of contents, and I think it will make more sense to you now that you've heard kind of what we've done. So this is part of what's called the Management on the Cutting Edge series that MIT Press has with MIT Sloan Management Review. There's a series of books related to it. We have an introduction, then we have 3 parts, right? So the book is Introducing Workforce Ecosystems, Orchestrating, which is basically details on the hexagon. And then part 3 is Developing Socially Responsible Workforce Ecosystems. So part 1 is what does it mean to have an extended workforce? 2 is what's a workforce ecosystem, which you just heard. And chapter 3 is strategy and workforce ecosystems. And one of the things I think is really important is we've talked about traditionally companies develop strategy and then they deal with workforce. We think if you think about the world as a workforce ecosystem, you can flip that script, right? This is why as a strategy professor, it's really interesting also, because I think it makes a lot of sense to start to think about if you have the capabilities of a workforce ecosystem and you have access to that workforce ecosystem, what does that mean for your strategy? Right? So we touched that briefly. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Part 2 is the bulk of the book, and it is marching through the hexagon, and part 3 is ethics, implications, and perspectives. It's on Amazon right now if you'd like to buy a pre-order copy. I have a QR code if you want to hit it there, and you can go to the page. I think that's it. We'll leave it there. So that's what I have prepared.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Amazing set of research. So now we do have some time for Q&A, and I should remind everyone we are recording. So what you say will be recorded for posterity. So choose your words carefully. Make it worth it for future social scientists to start, historians who are studying the archive.
I'm glad you said this after.
And we can, right, and we can actually start from the chat. So we have a few questions online.
Great.
So for instance, Jasmine Arafik is asking, how does the age of AI fit into this research? So obviously, I suppose we're thinking about things like ChatGPT, and you made some reference to. Sure. Would you like to briefly elaborate on that, please?
Sure. So it's a great topic. So again, not to keep pointing to elsewhere, but we have a article coming out soon on Brookings, which is the Brookings Institute, called Workforce Ecosystems and AI. Because we think that, so David knows a lot about AI and has done a lot of work in that area. And we see that how work is conducted, how work is managed, is being affected by AI. So you can't really talk about workforce ecosystems independently of how AI is affecting organizations. So right. we've started to kind of lay out a framework in this upcoming article, and I hope we'll do more from there.
So the long answer to Jasmine is in this article.
Yes, the long answer is wait a few weeks and go to Brookings.
Excellent. And then we have Mahmoud is asking, which industries and companies are most advanced in orchestrating workforce ecosystems?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. I think we also have a question in the room we'll get to in a bit. So I don't have a good data-driven answer. I do think it's a very interesting question to look at kind of what factors affect industries and their adoption of this. So for example, industries that are more regulated, you would think might not adopt them as much. So insurance, healthcare, defense. However, we see, NASA, for example, a big bureaucratic organization has been adopting it, this type of thinking. So I don't know yet which. I think it's a really good research question. Now, I can tell you we've looked at retail, healthcare, pharmaceutical, and you see examples across the board.
But presumably this is something that your data could answer, right?
The data could start to get at. I would use it as a directional question. Right.
In that spirit, and I'll get you in a second. Just I'm wondering from a methodological standpoint, you're presenting a lot of univariate statistics. This is the distribution of this variable in our sample. But what I wasn't seeing exactly was like, well, how does this break down by industry, or how does this break bivariate? Is there a particular reason for that? Because that would be quite interesting, don't you think?
Resources. So we can. There's no reason that we haven't, other than we just had to pick which analyses we're going to do.
Okay. So that's
but
maybe
with the right doctoral students and the right collaborators, then we could definitely do more.
excellent. So that's the future.
Yeah,
So,
we definitely can.
very good.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Well, then let's take I believe there was a question back there.
Yes, so I have a question.
Would you like to introduce?
My name is Titus. I'm a sociology doctoral student at the University of Chicago, and I'm visiting here today.
Great.
Coming straight from the airport,
Wow.
actually. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank
the
you.
concept of workforce ecosystem, which blows up the boundaries around the firm. And I liked your theorization of what it could mean for future management practices. However, when you introduce the concept to your interlocutors, you yourself say that they have competing definitions of what the term means. And then most of the questions are about managing external contractors rather than managing, for example, the chatbot workforce, or thinking about the workforce as the relation with Amazon cloud services. Right, so I see that you have this theoretical portion, and then when you speak to people, how do you know what they understand as the workforce ecosystem concept? Are there competing concepts which they are introducing? And you have a normative agenda as well, right? You think everybody should be thinking in terms of workforce ecosystems. I'm wondering if people are pushing back at you and saying that there should be a different person thinking about contractors and another person thinking about contractors that are competent.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So first of all, I gave some examples because of there again, you just heard like 55 minutes of 3 years of research, right? So we do look also at technologies and professional service firms and others. So if I gave the impression that we were only or mostly looking at contractors, that's not the case. It's often easier to explain these concepts vis-a-vis contractor versus employee for most audiences. But with that said, I also think it is true that most organizations that we speak with are at the very beginning of starting to think more holistically about this. They have complementers, they have professional service firms, bots, et cetera. They don't think about them truly integrated. We think, though, and my collaborators at Deloitte definitely agree with this, and I've spoken to companies that say the same thing, that that this is a good start. Right? That if, for example, if you start getting smarter about how you think about one element of a workforce ecosystem, you can then use that to get smarter about the rest of it. So I would say that, but I'm not hearing companies push back and say, no, that's the wrong way to do it. I think they're pushing back and saying, we can't do that yet. Like our systems can't do that yet. We don't have the capabilities. We'll be happy if we get this part under control, and then we'll work on the rest of it. So it's much more of a phased process, because these are complex organizations.
There's lots of questions online. Let's take maybe two together here from here. So do you think Connie McKissick is asking, amongst other things, do you think that there could be cases where a small business is just one employee and then mostly ecosystems, including AI? And then maybe a slightly related question from Burton and Bernard is, well, does this development of the workforce ecosystems lead to an increased precarity for the human employees?
So the second part of it first, this question about precarious work, there are a number of people who are doing really good research on, and I don't know yet if it's necessarily driving more precarious work, but absolutely kind of understanding what's happening around precarious work makes a lot of sense. The first part of the question, does this mean you could have smaller organizations that are at the core and then broader ecosystems? Maybe. We have an example. There's a company called Applause that does software testing. They have a community called U-Testers. I think they have, I think they're up to over 1 million testers and like in the hundreds of employees probably, right? So that's a perfect example where you have a very small core leveraging an enormous community, and software testing is the perfect example for that. So I think, that exists already today. And yes, as technologies enable more of it, we'll probably see some more of it. Do I think all companies are going to get to that extreme? No, I don't.
Thank you, Liz. Any questions from the room? Philip, please.
Yes, I'm Phil. I'm a student here at the OII. Thank you for this very interesting conceptualization. I'm wondering, after you've done all this research, what are your managerial recommendations or implications you see? So should companies in the future include everything in their HR, what you conceptualized?
So, so I do think, I have a point of view on this, that I think organizations benefit from thinking about a workforce with an ecosystem lens, right? And that it's a valuable perspective to think about who's contributing to your organization and the connections between those various parts. So there's no doubt I am biased, and I do think that is correct. What that means and what the implications are for management practices, leadership, technologies, et cetera, I think we're still working on. I would point you mostly back to the hexagon and those, oh, that was the timer. Yeah. Great, thanks. So those 4 hexagons, right? So the center is management practices, which is just very specific, like compensation, performance management, very detailed, by and large, HR-like things. But then going out, so leadership approaches, right? You're giving up control in many ways, right? These people don't all work for you. So what does that mean for leaders? I think there's a whole discussion to be had about leadership practices. We have some points of view on it. So I think there are technologies, how you adopt technologies, where you invest in technologies. Those are all good questions.
Thank you very much. Now we've unfortunately run out of time. So thank you everyone for the questions and comments. I'm sorry we weren't able to address all the questions online, but there are lots of resources available to address them, I think. So I'm sure it will be a wonderful book. The cover looks very promising, so I encourage everyone to check it out. And let's thank Liz once more for coming all the way to Oxford just to offer us this early insight into her work. So thank you very much.